In February and March 2021, Christian Evidence Society ran a series of 5 sessions. We at Still Unbelievable attended these, and over the next 3 episodes we will be reviewing our experience of these sessions from the perspective of non-Christians. This first episode covers the first 2 sessions, which are Jonathan Aitken talking about truth and Gillian Straine talking about healing. Episode 2 will cover Joel Edwards talking about race, and the final episode will cover Mike Hulme talking about climate and Rowan Williams talking about prayer and spirituality. Hello guys, welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. This is going to be the start of a 5 episode review series, although when I say episode I really mean 5 sit-down recording sessions which will end up being mashed together very likely into 1 episode, but possibly 2. It depends how long we chat. With that in mind, it's Andrew, of course, at the helm. Hello. And regular guest Darren. We're going to be reviewing something else again with you. Thank you for joining us.
Sounds fun.
It does. So this time we're reviewing 5 sessions from an organisation called the Christian Evidence Society, and we know about these because Justin Brierley publicised them. The first session we've just had, the title of it is Truth. The person who it was billed as giving it is the Reverend Jonathan Aitken, and British listeners will probably be very familiar with that name, so we'll come back to him in a short while. It was a chat with questions being fielded. So with Jonathan Aitken, the first half of the questions, which was about 45 minutes of questions, about the first half of the questions was about Jonathan, his life as a journalist and as a member of Parliament, what happened to him, his downfall, what happened after that, how he's become a reverend, and then they talked a little bit about Christianity. So I think probably for the people who are not English listeners, you won't know much about Jonathan Aitken. He went to prison, but basically he used to be a journalist in his younger years, and he became a member of Parliament. And he might have even been part of the cabinet, but that's not really important. And his downfall was basically over a treat. I think it was described as a meal in the conversation that we've just listened to, but it definitely was a lot more than just a meal. It was probably an extended stay in a very expensive London hotel. What was the problem was the person that paid the bill for this was a Saudi businessman who Jonathan described as a friend. Now, I think for context, around about that time, there was a lot of journalistic investigation into some British MPs' relationships with Saudi business people. And there was a lot of talk about selling of arms to Saudi over and above what was internationally legally allowed. So effectively, there were accusations around in the UK of illegal and surreptitious arms sales to Saudi Arabia. So that was part of what the problem. So the picture is a much bigger picture. So it's more than just a meal or more than just a stay. You know, it being a Saudi person with this background is part of what the problem was here. Allegations were made. Newspaper columns were written. Jonathan tried to sue the newspaper which allegedly published untruths about him, and he lost the case. And part of it all centered around this meal, in inverted commas, at a hotel, because Jonathan claimed his wife had paid for it, but actually his wife hadn't paid for it. The Saudi businessman had paid for it, and that just paved the way for his entire story to be unraveled, and so he ended up in prison having lied in court. It was a major fall from grace. Like I say, people in the UK who are of my age will remember this story, will know it well, and will immediately associate Jonathan Aitken with a shameful fall from grace of an MP and going into prison, and a relatively public conversion as well. I seem to remember hitting the newspapers about his conversion, and it might have been while he was still in prison. And certainly there were comments along the lines of, well, he's only done it so that he can shorten his stay in prison, and he can expedite his exit on good behaviour because he's done the prison Alpha course and he's converted and he's definitely a good boy now, so he's going to come out. And obviously now he's a reverend, and he's written various books, and at least 2 books, I think, on his fall from grace and his conversion experience and life after. Certainly 1, but I suspect there's a second one in there. So that's kind of a sketched background up there. Type the name Jonathan Aitken, that's Aiken, into Google, and you'll get the whole sordid story. It's out there. It's impossible for him to hide from it. It's that kind of a public story. Guys, I assume neither of you had really heard of Jonathan, as you're not British residents. Did either of you look him up? Did either of you fall across his story before tonight?
I remember his story in passing. What I thought was interesting, just as we sort of dip into the beginning of this broadcast they did, was that the detail that you just gave in regard to his history was much, much, much more complete than what they went into, and they had plenty of time to do it. So it's not as if they didn't talk through his time in prison, et cetera. And so what was interesting to me is that they didn't shape his background to sort of equal the amount of wrong that was in the public eye. I thought that it should have been a more open conversation about his background before they moved into the conversation about trust, because for me, it felt like not being honest about his background in full, and then that casts a shadow on the idea that he's talking about trust. I appreciate that you went through and refreshed that whole background, because being accused of something like illegal arms sales and being a trusted politician in your country and having ties to business leaders and politicians in other countries that you're not being completely forthright about, those things should be questioned, right? And this thing that he did was, in the end, not just a matter of some malfeasance where people could walk away from it and say, okay, yeah, he's a young guy and hopefully he's learned his lesson. Whatever actually went on, it was enough that he was convicted. This is not like he ran a red light. This was more substantial than that. And I felt like they should have done that justice in the run up to the rest of the conversation.
It was in the middle of the presentation when I found out that he had gone to prison that I looked him up. And when did he become a Christian chaplain? Was that before or after he went to jail?
The chaplaincy was after he came out of jail. But I'm fairly sure became Christian in jail, but the chaplaincy happened afterwards.
Yeah, I don't know. I just think having someone who's obviously been fake then decided to join the church where a lot of people go to be fake wasn't a good pairing for what the talk was.
Yeah, see, now it's interesting that you say that, because, again, the other context here is because I was a Christian when this story broke, and certainly when his conversion broke as well. And he has become a bit of a darling to the UK church because they see him as a reformed character. And the Bible is full of highly flawed but reformed characters. You know, Christians will hold up Moses as an example with that, or King David as an example of that. So people who are highly flawed had an amazing fall from grace and had redemption as a result. Jonathan plays right into that. And so because he's now become a reverend, so he's flying his Christian flag properly. You know, he didn't just do it for show. And he, as came out on that, he is a prison chaplain as well. And he does go into prisons and talk to people about their experiences. So let's take it on face value. He does genuinely try to make some good from his situation to try to help others who find themselves in the same situation. From the Christian perspective, he is attractive and the right kind of person to have for this kind of talk.
That story is probably the most popular one in Christianity. And all of the Christian con artists that you see on TV that you can tell are con artists from just by looking, all of them have that story, which is why I'm always dubious whenever someone comes up and says, oh, I was changed and now I'm a Christian minister, please give me money.
I want to say something that's going to be slightly controversial to everything that's been said so far, because I think that we live in both of our countries, the United States and the United Kingdom, have this sort of idea that people can change. You know, that you do something wrong, you pay your debt to society, you do the hard mental work of figuring out what went wrong in your life, and at the end of that, hopefully there are changed people. I want to say that I don't actually have a problem with that as a sort of ethic that we hold as individuals, if you do hold that ethic, and as a society. I think this is a healthy way to treat each other, and hopefully it is possible for people to change. So I don't want to end up in a place where it sounds entirely like, at least for my part, that I am backing the idea that people can't change. I do think that people change. I certainly have changed over the course of my life, and I think for the better. The problem is when the change has what could clearly be seen to be a motivation in order to avoid the negative consequences of past bad acts. So, you do it publicly, right? You go through some big conversion to save yourself from additional jail time. So I think it's right to point that out and question what people's motivations might possibly be, while still saying that it is possible, at least in my view. I don't know what you guys think, but in my view, it is possible for people to change, even to change substantially.
Yeah, I think it's possible for people to be able to change. I don't think it's as common as people really think it is. And I don't think...
I think it's about as rare as hen's teeth, but...
I mean, it's like Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. I mean, he used all the same tactics that he used prior to that when he was arrested for conning people out of their money, and he used all the same tactics that he was doing for that to found his religion, and that was after he went to jail. And I'm assuming you could probably find him saying the same sorts of things, that he changed, that he was a new person. And I think the biggest problem is that the Christian, because I think I agree, most Christians are probably good people and honest and sincere about what they want to see out of the world. And unfortunately, that because of the culture that Christianity has sort of perpetuated, it makes them easy marks. It makes them real easy to be taken advantage of.
Yeah, the motivated reasoning allows for people to take advantage of that. I agree. Matthew, what do you think? Can people change?
I think they can, yes. I don't know how you tell the difference between somebody who's genuinely changed and somebody who is huckstering. Mm-hmm. I hope that there would be a tell eventually where you would be able to work it out and something will out them. But I think for every huckster that trips and falls, there are probably 10 who manage to maintain the lie.
Yeah, well, I think once they start asking for money, that's the big red flag that you should be looking at.
Yeah.
So to bring it back on, has Jonathan had a genuine turnaround? I think there certainly has been a genuine turnaround. Whether it's full or not, I'm not going to speculate. But certainly, I think in terms of the things that he does, the Church of England doesn't accept just about anybody as a reverend, although there might be some Christians who might quibble with me on that. But there is a selection process that you have to go through, and you have an interview, and people will push you on your opinions and your responses on certain critical subjects, including ones that might be publicly unpopular. So the Church of England do go through a fairly hefty selection criteria for becoming a reverend. I am absolutely prepared to accept that he is full-on reformed, and certainly with the work that he does in prisons. He talked about working with Sikhs and Muslims as well in prisons, because you'll have those as prison chaplains for people from their communities too, in the work that he does. So I'm certainly prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt on that. Let's also bear in mind that he mentioned he's got 17 books under his belt. Okay, some of them have been written post-prison. But he's got an income from those. He's got an income from some of the things that he did as an MP. I don't know how much wealth he had behind him. He's probably got a reasonable pension from his days as a journalist. So I imagine in terms of finance, he probably doesn't need to huckster for money. So he can live the lifestyle that he chooses to live. And if he gets satisfaction from living this lifestyle, who am I to complain, really?
Even if he had money behind him, I still think that there's a great motivated reason to fake the change, and not necessarily what I'm claiming that he has done, but no matter how much money we have, how many of us want to live lives as a pariah and as a social outcast, as someone who walks around with a purple mark on their foreheads, the person that's ostracized from the society in which they live? I think there's a big reason, a big motivation to pretend to have changed. Now, by the way, he seems to be doing everything that says he's not pretending, right? Prison ministry and all of that sort of thing. I do think that there is a significant motivation in just avoiding being a pariah in one's own community.
I just looked it up, and his estimated net worth is $17 million.
Well, I don't know what to think about all of that.
That is a reasonable good point, actually, Andrew, and I hadn't seriously appreciated that. The conversion cancels out a lot of the pariah status that he would have, I suspect. Yeah. We've spent a lot more on this subject than I expected to, and I think part of the reasons that we're spending so much on this is half of the interview was basically around, not necessarily on this particular subject, but certainly around the lead up to and his subsequent fall from grace and some of the reasons behind it. What I was hoping for from this was at least some form of presentation, which we didn't get, and some form of banner of why Christianity should be associated with truth and where we go from there, and some kind of challenge to us who are non-believers about accepting Christianity as truth. And we didn't really get that. So we're having to talk about something else. And so we've landed on, unfortunately, the character or the past character of Jonathan Aitken. So that's why we've landed on this subject. If you're listening here wondering why we're spending 15 minutes assassinating this poor gentleman's character. But so let's try and move this on a little bit. So the really interesting bit really is the questions towards the end. And there's one question that I want to pull out because I was really disappointed with the answer to it. And I think it's a genuinely interesting question and fits with the subject of truth. And the question was, how do we balance the right to free speech with the spread of dangerous lies, e.g. anti-vax? And the answer to that was essentially, well, I believe that eventually the truth will out. And I was really, really disappointed with that as an answer.
As a pairing to that question, the only question that I sent in was he talked about having a deep faith in Christianity, and in part of that paragraph, some experience with the Holy Spirit, et cetera, et cetera. And the question that I sent over that did not get asked for the listeners, so it was not asked on air, but similar to this question is, faith is a common religious word. In fact, it's ubiquitous, this idea of having faith in one's God. So I pointed out that faith seems to cover any possible conviction that one can have. So what methodology should one pair with faith in order to decide what things one believes that most closely align with the world we live in and what things don't? Because faith doesn't seem to be a good tool. It didn't get asked, but that was the promise of this show, truth. In a world of fake news, how do we know who to trust? And I felt let down in regard to an answer to that question.
What sort of answer would we like to see to the question, how do we balance the right to free speech with the spread of dangerous lies?
I think we've got to ask the question about methodology. How does one know a lie from truth, right? Journalists seem to be able. Well, actually, I'm not sure. Does the word journalist mean anything now? I don't know the answer to that, given how much news is in social media feeds. Do we even know what journalism is anymore? I don't mean the three of us. I mean, in general, does society have respect for the idea of journalism? What do you guys think?
I think it is reduced. I think there used to be a time when being an investigative journalist was something that people respected. They were key characters they were the hero character in cop shows sometimes. Yeah. Investigative journalists putting themselves in physical danger to not just get a story, but to uncover a great wrong. And people looked to journalists to do those kinds of things because they asked the questions. I don't think society views journalists with the same high regard, and I think that's a shame.
I think there's a reason for that. I want to say it was the 80s, but there used to be a law in place in the U.S. where news actually had to be telling the truth. I don't know how they arbitrated that, but I think it was the first Bush, or maybe the second Bush, that ended up getting rid of that law.
Yeah, 1989 rings a bell to me too, and that's Bush number 1. but I don't remember the law specifically. It has been in the press in the last few weeks because of what has gone on with News Corp and Fox News, and moving away from daily news programming to opinion programming, the likes of Tucker Carlson, all of those cats. So that law has been in the news, and the fall of that kind of, and it wasn't just a law, it was a way we regulated journalism, right? And we don't do that now in the same way. But I think Fox News is a cautionary tale about the disregard that we have for journalism today.
Pew did a poll at one point, and they found that people that only watch Fox News know less about what's going on in the world than people that don't actually watch the news.
Oh, wow.
I think there's more to it than that, though, but because the fundamental philosophy in a lot of the news programs is balance. So the whole global warming controversy came about. You have 99% of the climate scientists all say that global warming is human driven, and then you get one person who's an outlier, and they feel they have to bring on that one person. It sort of gave the illusion that it was an actual debate, that the data wasn't clear, which has caused all sorts of problems. So even beyond Fox News, that primary philosophy of balance also causes its own problems. And then, of course, there's the problem that we just don't teach critical thinking in our schools. Republicans and the Christian right have opposed every single measure to try to implement critical thinking in our schools.
You mentioned single objectors and that kind of thing, and the same thing is true for the anti-vaxxer movement. You've got this one discredited doctor who did a self-study of vaccinations, right? And he publishes this, and now we have a whole community of anti-vaxxers, and this guy, not only does his study not have any credibility, he lost his medical license. You can only sort of gloss this one of two ways, right? You can only say, oh, well, he's the actual guy telling the truth, and Big Pharma is so powerful and they're so slimy that they de-license this guy because he found them out, right? That's one option. And the other option is to say, well, no, actually, there are honest people who tried to reproduce his work and it failed, and he has deserved the marginalization that he gets. And it's extraordinary to me just how many people buy the anti-vaxxer movement in light of these kinds of problems.
Well, unfortunately, the anti-vaxxer has celebrities touting it.
Yes.
The old paper journalists, newspaper journalists, they actually had standards they had to meet.
Yeah.
And now anyone with a blog can be considered a journalist, and there's no standards or anything that for them to meet. They can just write whatever they want.
I think it is right on point. We all write occasionally, if only in discussion groups. How do people tell whether they can trust us or not? It's part and parcel of this truth conversation. What makes us trustworthy?
Difficult balance. Matthew started this whole conversation off with what's the difference between free speech and hate speech, and
Right.
How do we balance the two? It's a hard question because without critical thinking skills, without people actually using reliable methods to distinguish fact from fiction, how much is the government obliged to regulate to a population that can't tell the difference?
Well,
yeah, that's a good question, that one is.
Yeah.
I think one thing that I would look for, and I try to practice it on this podcast whenever I make a statement, is I invite fact-checking, and I think somebody who welcomes critique, welcomes their words being validated, invites people to go and check up on what it is that they've said, if that's possible. I think that's probably somebody who is, on balance, probably more trustworthy than somebody who won't let their words be checked or validated.
Is it a mental mistake to think of some source as generally reliable? So when we say we use reliable sources, are we in danger of making an argument from authority error? Or can we have reliable sources? Because in this hate speech conversation, we have to sort of take a hard look at things like QAnon, right? And the alt-right movement and all of that. Go ahead.
40% of the Republicans that still think that the election was stolen because of hacking voting machines and stuff.
Mm.
Right. And so trying to give some philosophical charity to the other side. I don't think all Republicans are idiots, and I don't think they're all dishonest. We do have a very different way of looking at the world. But if they're not poorly reasoned and they're not dishonest, then what makes my speech not hate speech and makes their speech, well, okay, so it's not on, probably not categorize, saying Trump really won the election as hate speech, certainly as false news, as fake news. When I claim my source is reliable and their source is not, what keeps me from just making the argument from authority fallacy, from committing that fallacy?
I think it's your ability to demonstrate that your source is in fact accurate. How many people actually care? I mean, Trump lost, 60, 63, 64 lawsuits. He was never able to produce any evidence, and yet people still, do people really care about evidence and facts these days?
We started with a British disgraced politician and ended up as an American disgraced politician.
Well, at least your disgraced politician has the class enough to know that he was actually disgraced at one point.
Well, there is that, yes. There is that. So one of the other questions, and I think the answer to this gives a little bit of clue of the kind of sass and savviness that Jonathan Aitken has, and it gives a little bit of a clue to the kind of Christianity that is mostly pervasive here in the UK, and it will disappoint many Christians throughout the world. So the question was, are other religions less true than Christianity? And for most of this answer, Jonathan talked around how he works with Muslim and Sikh counterparts in the prison, and he's preached at a mosque. So he talked about, so the context of his answer was that he has existing relationships with Muslims and Sikhs and presumably other religions as well, and he works actively with them. So he probably doesn't want to say anything that will upset any of them. So the answer that he gave to this question was basically summed up as they have their own paths. And I think those are the exact words that he actually said, which for a Christian who believes that Christianity is the only way, that will be a terribly disappointing answer to hear. But I get why that was the answer that he gave. And I think there are many people who are hoping for something with a little bit more punch to it. So does that answer give you guys any kind of impression of the kind of Christianity that Jonathan has?
I think in the States he would be a liberal Christian.
That's the worst kind of Christian, isn't it? That's almost no Christian at all. I mean, here in the UK, most Christians are liberal Christians. I mean, that's what is mostly in the Church of England, and most Church of England reverends would be what we call liberal Christians, I suspect.
I don't know. I think if he was in some parts of the States, he would lose his job for saying something like that.
Really?
Yeah.
I can't imagine that kind of answer being of any risk whatsoever here in the UK. In fact, giving the other answer would be of more risk.
Yeah. Well, Andrew, you were part of a fairly conservative church, right?
Yes. Yes.
I mean, would he have survived as a pastor?
No.
Yeah.
No. It's not even a close call.
He didn't suggest that the paths were the right paths. He just said they have their own paths. There was no qualification given to the paths of. They could have the wrong path, but they still have their own path. He didn't qualify what their paths were.
Well, I think he did, but only in the sense that he said, I have lots of places where I agree with my Muslim, Buddhist, and Hindu counterparts, wasn't the word he used, but it's that kind of thing. And he said, and I preach in a mosque, and I don't know very many Christians that get to do that. And so for me, and maybe this is a difference in just living in the United States versus living in the UK. So if it is, I accept that. But it very much seemed to me that when he said, we have these spiritual things that we agree on, and hey, by the way, I'm one of the few Christians that gets to preach in a mosque, he's actually lending some credence to the idea that these other religious paths, if you will, whatever, Muslim, Hindu, whatever, he's actually lending some legs to the idea that maybe they're not all doomed.
I think that really speaks to one of the other questions that he was asked, how do you identify fake news? Apparently he said, go to the source and ask if the source is credible. From outside looking in, someone who's looked at a lot of religions, when people go to the Bible and say that it's credible, then you have a fundamental problem with their ability to distinguish fact from fiction. And I think when he can go into a mosque and say, well, these guys have a similar path or whatever, I think that's all part of the same problem. He doesn't really have any reliable way to distinguish fact from fiction, so he's just going in doing what he's doing.
That struck me too, by saying that Matthew, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to ask you, am I wrong about the way someone in the UK would think about what he said about multiple paths, or however he glossed that? Do I just see that from an American point of view in what I said, and a UK mind just wouldn't see it the same way?
There are certainly significant numbers in the UK who would see it in a similar way to you, but I suspect their reaction would be muted and less visceral. They'd raise their eyebrow and have another sip of their tea, whereas you guys would get your guns out and shoot a post.
Well, we wouldn't have to get them out.
We do things in such an understated way here in the UK. You guys really should try it.
I'm trying. It's it's a good partnership. You should have seen me before I started podcasting with you.
So some would half raise their left eyebrow at that as an answer, but they would go to the point that I made was, well, he didn't say that the paths were all the right paths. He just said they have their own paths. And they would say, he was being political in his answer there, and they would leave it as that, and they'd be okay. But there are also some Christians in the UK who are quite happy to take the line that other religions still worship the same God, they just do it differently.
Yeah, it's definitely a liberal Christian mindset.
So Darren, I agree with you. The trouble, I think, even with talking about other paths, suggesting that he finds agreement with his Muslim, Buddhist, and Hindu religious colleagues, is that he doesn't have an epistemology that is very good at identifying what those things are in the world that are most likely to be true when he uses this sort of religious mindset, right? He has this deep faith, and however the world might contradict that, it is this deep faith that he will rely on, and that is the kind of epistemology that I would want to stand in opposition to.
Well, maybe his epistemology is that he's more interested in what works than what's right. If he's more interested in getting next to his Muslim and his Sikh neighbours and working with them to make the lives of prisoners better and more comfortable, and make the mental health of prisoners better and more comfortable. And maybe he's more interested in achieving that as a goal than actually arguing over what is true.
That is a very flattering take on that. I would go the other way. I would just say that the more religions he has under his belt, the more people he can fleece.
And I agree with both of you, and I will just say, if that's his view, he shouldn't have been the guy talking about truth. In a world of fake news, how should we know who to trust? How can we know?
Fair. I didn't set that up for you. That is a very fair response. Okay, just one last one before we introduce who the next person will be, and let's just assume, for argument's sake, that he is genuinely reformed gentleman. And this is the Christianity that he lives, and he lives it to the best of his ability. Does what he tries to do and what he does, and does his statement that all religions have their own paths, does that make that kind of Christianity more attractive to you guys at all?
No.
The Christianity that is most attractive to me is the ones that don't try to legislate their insanity into our laws. So I don't really care if he's Westboro Baptist Church or the Unification Church or whatever it is. As long as he's not trying to make laws based on his beliefs, I don't care.
That would have been a wonderful question to have been asked on the thing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it was, but it had been a lovely one that I'd have loved to hear a politician answer, is to what extent should their religion inform the laws that they try to put onto others. Maybe that's something we can try and have for another time. Thank you both. The next session is in a week's time, and it is the Reverend Dr. Gillian Straine talking about health and well-being. Hello listeners, and we're back again now for week 2 of the Christian Evidence Society series of 5 discussions. So this week, Reverend Gillian Straine, and it's about health and how do I find wholeness in a broken world. Now I'm going to come straight out and say I'm going to wave the sexist flag, because when it comes to subjects and discussions like this, I much prefer to hear a woman speak on this subject, because I think women show a level of compassion and a level of care for the well-being of their fellow humans in a way that there are men who just can't. So I'm glad it was a woman doing this, and I really enjoyed hearing her talk. And I think there are some things, and this is one of them, where women just simply outshine men by a measure that's really hard to compare. And in terms of the questions being asked and the answers that were given this evening, I enjoyed this evening's discussion much more than I did last week's one about truth. What are your thoughts, Darren?
I really couldn't get beyond the fact that she had no real coherent theology. And I don't know if that was because she was just going with whatever she was being taught, because I think she was a priest of the Anglican Church, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I don't know if that's just because she's just parroting what she was taught, or what's going on with that, or if the theology itself is just so incoherent that it's impossible to have a coherent, consistent theology. I'm not familiar enough with the Anglican theology to make that determination.
There are breeds within the British Anglican Church, so you'll find slight variances across them all. I think it's because you and myself included don't even find anything about what is core Christianity coherent anyway. So regardless how polished somebody's theology is, I think you probably would still walk away thinking there was nothing coherent about that.
That's entirely possible, but for some reason the healing part of it really highlighted the fact.
Yes, that's true. And before I forget, I just want to give apologies from Andrew. Andrew can't make it this evening, so you have only got Darren and myself talking about it this evening.
Yep.
So
don't stop the podcast. We're still good.
Yes. So the conversation was mostly around healing. Where does healing fit in the world today? There was obviously a couple of references to COVID-19, but it certainly didn't focus around COVID-19. I don't really see where the Christian God being involved in healing works in this conversation. And I think this is one of the reasons why I walked out in the end. So none of the answers that tried to match anything relating to healing to faith or to God or to the miraculous, none of that landed with me at all. But Gillian didn't just talk about that. She talked a lot about caring for the person, about the charity that she is involved in, about it being caring for the person. She talked about later on in the talk about when priests are in hospitals, things like that, they're there for after the physical healing to help with the mental well-being of the person, talked about the spiritual well-being of the person. And again, that's something that I don't connect with. Certainly the context was, and this is something that I'm familiar with, having been part of a healing ministry in an Anglican church 20 something years ago now, and it was very much about wholeness. Wholeness was a big buzzword, so some of the things that she said were very familiar to me and really brought back memories of my involvement with praying for people to be healed at the back of a church before. And this wholeness thing is a real ethos that goes through this whole part of the Anglican Church in England, certainly where it's involved with touching on people who need healing, whether it's emotional or whether it's physical. They really do emphasize that it's more than just physical healing. You can not be healed, but be, inverted commas, healed. And so again, I wasn't surprised to see her using air quotes about that, because you can be comfortable with your disability or comfortable with your unhealed cancer, in the terms of Gillian, where she's constantly dealing with cancer in her life. You can be mentally healthy and carry that disease or that illness and be considered whole or be considered healed. That is the woolly nature of which healing can often be viewed in this part of Christendom. So does that help at all?
No, that's actually what causes the problem, because it took me about half the program before I realized that when she's talking about healing, she's not talking about physical healing.
Not always, no.
Yeah, her definition of healing is having people have good feelings and give them a community that they can be happy in.
Yes.
That's her definition of healing. And it took me a while to figure that's what she was talking about, because anytime anyone talked about any sort of physical healing, she went straight to science, doctors, hospital, all the time, go there. In fact, I think she was asked where it was a question between if someone needs to be healed. And I don't think he was using healing in the same way that she was, because he asked a question of if there's a difference between being healed, do you recommend they go to the hospital or get prayer? I think that kind of threw her, because she doesn't think of healing in that way. So for her, it was obviously if they have a broken leg or something, you send them to a hospital, science, doctors, 100%. And then once they get out of the hospital, then they can come to a potluck and have good feelings because they're in a community afterwards.
Yes, I think you picked up on that better than I did, probably because I've been in there and I'm used to this woolly nature that the word healing can have. So I think you were more sensitive to that discrepancy than I was. I think it makes the conversation difficult at times if people are using a different meaning for a word as simple as healing.
Yeah, because it's one of those things that makes the whole thing incoherent and inconsistent. Because he was constantly bringing up healing as, physical healing. He brought up the whole healing ministry, starting with Jesus, because Jesus healed lepers and the blind and all that. And I think she was at a point where she realized that God doesn't actually do any physical healings. So she had to sort of move it away from that physical healings ministry to, you get good feelings when you come to this community.
And I think that's where this concept of wholeness comes in. And that was a word that Gillian used quite a lot. And often when Christians who are involved in healing are talking about healing in Christian language, they usually mean something that's more akin to what they mean by wholeness, which is looking at the whole individual and making sure that the individual is emotionally happy and able to function. And that's where they're driving towards often when they actually use the word healing. They probably mean what they mean by wholeness, but wholeness is a much more fuzzy and ambiguous word.
Yeah, I agree. And then they also like to take credit for the doctor's skills. The doctor healing you is suddenly God healing you type of thing.
Yes, I did get a little bit of a whiff of that kind of thing, because this came down in the questions from the listeners down at the end when somebody asked the question about, is there any illness that God has sent? And the emphatic answer was no, God never sends anything that's bad.
And yet, at the very last question she answered was,
Has your cancer brought you closer to God?
Right, and she said that God was leading her through the cancer to do a specific thing, which I found was a different answer than the one she gave previously when she said God does not send illness.
I know it's a really murky thing there, this whole distinction between allows it to happen and uses it for good and sends it. And, it's a technicality without much of a difference, really, because the effect, if God is real, is the same. So he may as well have.
Right, except saying that God uses it for good is a completely incoherent statement, because if it just happened naturally and God had nothing to do with it, then God isn't using it for anything. It's just happening.
Yes. This brings up the whole question is, would you rather have a painful, unpleasant experience that is long lasting to learn a short lesson, or would you rather have neither? And I think I'd rather have neither.
Or would you prefer just to have the lesson without the painful experience?
Yes, quite. Can God create a world where we can learn these things without having to go through, sometimes for some people, really terrible suffering for it?
Supposedly heaven exists, and I'm assuming people don't stop learning while they're in heaven. So
yeah, and I think that gets to the nub of the problem of pain and suffering. And I know many Christians have tried to answer it, but I think the problem still exists. This particular problem wasn't addressed and wasn't attempted to be addressed in this discussion, and possibly wisely, because I think all these things fall over trip over and fall down rather over that particular issue, because I just don't think it works. I don't think there's a way to get out of that.
Yeah, neither do I, especially considering they think that God created everything. The religions with more than one God have it easier because you can have one God that's actually loving and another God that's hateful, and then the hateful God is usually the one that created the world, and the loving God is usually the one that's trying to save people from the world that the hateful God created. Whereas in Christianity, they're stuck in this weird in-between place where they've got a loving God that supposedly loves everyone, but he created a world where if he is distanced from it, then it does all these horrible things. And they don't seem to make the connection that in order for it to do all these horrible things, if God is distanced from it, which is a phrase that she used quite often, then God would have had to create it to do specifically that when he was distanced from it. So
I know, and I'm trying to answer that as though I was still a Christian. I don't know how to do it. It's difficult.
It's one of the things that makes the whole story completely incoherent.
Yes. Now, there was an interesting question that came up. I think I must have zoned out because I didn't write any notes on how Gillian responded to the question, but somebody else, maybe you can answer, Darren. Somebody asked a question which I thought was quite good. Modern hospitals don't have exorcists on staff. Doesn't that show that the New Testament is miles away from hospitals now? So obviously the reference here to Jesus healing people by casting out demons, and we don't do that in hospitals now. So doesn't that show there's a gulf between what was going on in Jesus's day and what we do now? Can you remember how Gillian answered that one?
She meandered a lot. She didn't really answer that, but her final conclusion seemed to be something along the lines of, well, they just didn't know what was going on back then. And we do now because of science and medicine and what we've discovered about how the body works.
Right.
And which actually prompted me to put in my notes while I was doing that. Okay, so if that's possible, that the Bible was written by people who didn't understand what was going on and they misinterpreted what was going on, then how does that not
Yes, I remember that
reflect
now, yes.
on the rest of the Bible and all the other stories?
That's a really good point, because if you expand the context of that, it immediately gives you permission to question the understanding of pretty much everything that was written down there was Jesus walking on water,
Or
written by people
the
who didn't understand things that were going on. Yeah, the magical fishes that jumped into the nets, and so the boat started to sink. Yeah, the rising from the dead, and the breaking of the bread and feeding 5,000, and all these things. It effectively gives you permission to start doubting all of that stuff.
Yeah, and I don't. The Catholic and Anglican Church is sort of interesting because they're old enough institutions, and they've had non-believers sort of in their ranks for so long that it's sort of affected their theology. And I wonder how much of that the Anglican Church, the priests of the Anglican Church actually believe, even though they preach it from the pulpits.
I do wonder that myself. And certainly with the Anglican Church and the way it's set up, there very probably are priests or vicars rather, who preach every Sunday, who lead churches, lead sermons, who no longer believe.
Yeah, and that's sort of the sense I got from Gillian, was that she really didn't believe. Belief is sort of this weird thing, because you believe in belief, and then you have what you actually expect how reality works. And I don't think she really believed, that deeper level of any of the healing properties of church or prayer or anything else like that. I think she was probably had belief in belief, the sort of the upper level light belief type thing, but I don't think she really believed it on a very fundamental level.
I think she did, but she didn't have that fervor that the deeply committed, I was going to say extremist, I don't mean extremist Christian, but the deeply committed evangelical fundamentalist Christian, she didn't have that fervor, which is probably why I liked her. Because that kind of, but at least with those people, that they really do believe what they're saying, even though it's still distasteful. Whereas I like people like Gillian, but you're right, they'll say things and you do sometimes wonder, are they saying what they think works, and do they actually believe this? Because that fervor of belief isn't there behind their eyes.
I don't think fervor is really required. The way she talked, because she sort of moved her faith away from anything that's falsifiable, anything that could be tested, anything that could be checked, even anything that has any substance. Because anytime it was a physical healing, it was straight to the hospital, science, whatever. And then when she's talking about her spiritual healing, it was all, okay, so this can produce a psychosomatic result, which makes you feel better, which having community has been shown to help with heart disease. Every time she gave a reason for her healing, it was always a naturalistic, scientific reason for it. It was never, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it is. And I was going to use that as a springboard to go into my question, which I asked, because I think her answer, because I asked a question and my question got asked this week, I think her answer touches on that. So the question that I asked, many Christians claim to have been healed by prayer. How do you determine the difference between being healed by that prayer and healed naturally despite the prayer? So Gillian acknowledged it was a good question, and then kind of cheekily asked who created the body. But then she did start talking about science and started talking about things that can be evidenced. She said, we don't understand enough about the brain to answer that question fully. I pretty much agree and acknowledge that. She made a reference to psychosomatics and said, the immune system can be helped through positive experiences through other people. Again, this is something that we know we're learning more about, and again an answer that I agree with. And then she said she doesn't think science knows enough, and then offered a yet at the end of that. I don't know if I'd be confident enough to place a yet at the end of I don't think science knows enough, but largely I agreed, and I said I think that's the best answer I've heard a Christian give to that question, because I've asked it a few times to other people and it's kind of been avoided, but she hit it straight on and she did give it a really good answer. But I think the point I'd like to make is the answers she gave were all the science side of the answer.
Right, and that was actually the question that started me thinking that she doesn't actually have that deep-seated belief in things. And then that was sort of confirmed when she answered the question that I put out.
Oh, which was the question you put out?
Oh, it's the one you would expect. Why do you need a hospital when you have a personal relationship with Creator of the universe that supposedly loves you? Does the fact that the Guild always recommends going to a hospital not indicate that on some level you already know that God doesn't do any healing?
Right.
And that's when she said, oh, well, spiritual healing is a quote-unquote deeper healing.
Yeah.
And then that's when she was, taking credit for the skills of the doctor and saying that the church offers community and all that.
Yeah, didn't she also say something about some hospitals were created or inspired or set up, whatever the right word is, by priests and monks? Yeah, that's right. She said monks, didn't she? I thought that was an odd choice of word. It's not.
Well, it's because they weren't set up by Christian monks. They were set up by pagan monks.
Cheeky, yes. You know what? That's probably quite true, actually.
Oh, it is.
She didn't go down the road of they were set up by Christians, therefore hospitals are a Christian thing. She didn't do that, which I was very relieved to hear. But she did. I think the way that she was saying it was that people who are religious or spiritual or even Christian do it because they care about the well-being of other people. So I think the way that she framed that comment was, it's people with a spiritual bent who care about their fellow humans, want to see them better in every way they can, and so the hospitals get created by that. So she wasn't trying to own hospitals and healing as a Christian thing because Christians set them up, which I know some people have said. So yeah, maybe you've got a point in what you've been saying, that maybe we'll have to try and get in touch with her and ask her that question directly.
Obviously, if she has belief in belief, she's going to think she believes it. It's just one of those things that, there's what people believe and what they profess they believe, and then how they actually act in the real world, And it's usually the actions that people take that really shows what a person believes deep down, even if they don't realize that's what they believe deep down.
Yeah, I'm going to hold out without commenting further on that. Thank you for your time, Darren. Thank you for putting yourself through this and helping Andrew and myself out through this. So in summary on this, regardless of what Gillian's faith is, she is a person I admire. From what I've heard, she is a person who cares genuinely for other people. She's a person who cares quite obviously, I think, for the well-being of other people. She is a person who has suffered herself, and I suspect that suffering that she's had probably helps her to get alongside and to understand other people who are suffering equally. And I can only admire that she puts herself through that. I do think she has an integrity and an honesty about her in some of the answers that she's given here, and in that she genuinely, and I think that really came across, genuinely cares about other people. And within that context, I don't really care what her beliefs are, because I think she is the sort of person who I could happily work alongside if I was in the area, if I was in a medical role. She is absolutely the right sort of person who would be looking after the mental and emotional well-being of people around me. And I genuinely don't really care what her faith statement is on that matter, because she cares for people and wants to see them improved. And I think that's really how I'm going to finish that one up on there. Thank you, Gillian, for what was, for me, certainly a rather pleasant hour. Next week, we have Joel Edwards' OBE. The subject is race. We shall see how that will go. I don't have any spoilers whatsoever to give on that. He's a name I don't know, so I'll have to look him up and see what links I can find about him. Thank you for listening, and goodbye. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.